With all the talk of the massive public sector net borrowing requirement of something like 300 billion, more than that, inevitably there has been some talk. We've had a few questions about the likelihood of a wealth tax. So I thought I'd do a little bit of work on that and give you the benefit of my work. Wealth tax, actually quite a challenge, actually. It's been dropped by so many countries that originally introduced it around Europe. Sweden, Denmark, France, Germany included. So just couldn't make it work in the way that they thought it would, couldn't make it generate as much revenue as they thought it would, couldn't overcome the difficulties of collection. And therein are some of the challenges. First, what's subject to the wealth tax? What should be subject to the wealth tax? There's an interesting philosophy that says the only assets that should be subject to wealth tax are those assets that where the capital value of them or the income that they generate or any gains that you make from them aren't themselves subject to tax. That leads you inexorably to main residences, which in the UK, because I'm talking about the UK and what challenges would there be to introduce a wealth tax in the UK. And of course, the main residence is the obvious asset where you don't derive income from it that's subject to tax, mostly, if it's your main residence where you live. And the capital gains aren't subject to tax. And yet, of course, there might be inheritance tax on it if it exceeds the residence nil rate band and your other available nil rate band and exemptions, etc. So property subject to tax. Well, we kind of already have a tax that taxes residential property. It's called council tax. And the value of the property that is subject to council tax is anchored in the 1991 value. So there could be a little bit of scope there for getting some wealth tax on a particular asset that is residential property by re-rating it, by looking at current values instead of 1991 values. I'm not proposing this, I'm just saying that's a way that they could go. And in the past, in 2015, the Labour Party pre-election were proposing a form of wealth tax effectively on property, a mansion tax for properties above, I think, £2 million. Even the Conservative Party ahead of this last election were, I think, considering it a form of mansion tax, but quite understandably, I think, dropped that. So at the moment, we don't have a proposal for any kind of wealth tax or mansion tax in the UK. But if we were to have one, what could it be? Yeah, it could be residential property. It could be on all assets. The economics unit of the Manchester Metropolitan University suggested that if all the assets in the UK, everybody's assets, everybody's personal assets, everything that they own, including their main residence, was subject to a 2% wealth tax, it would generate around 300 billion, and that would wipe out pretty much the public sector net borrowing requirements. So that's unlikely to happen. It was just an interesting fact. Valuation is a big challenge for wealth tax. It's been proven to be in the past. Every year you need to value the assets. How do you value them? The challenge to valuation and the resulting cost of just getting the valuation. Then there's collection of the tax. What if the substance of the assets that have been valued are illiquid? Great that you've got the value, but how do you get the money to actually pay the tax and collect it? That the flexibility, the way you can move capital around the world these days is much greater. So moving capital so that it isn't subject to wealth tax is another challenge that we'd have to deal with. Avoidance, another challenge that has to be dealt with. And so when you consider all of those challenges, together with the fact that a wealth tax is not the most obvious tax for a Conservative government to embrace, you can see the challenges that exist and why, on balance, one would feel that a wealth tax is not likely to be introduced into this country. Famous last words. Who knows? A form of it may be with increased rateable values for the council tax. And of course, the government would then need to get some of that money back if it's to come into central funds from local government. So let's have a look at what's happened around the world. Wealth tax was a subject of discussion in the US. Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were both big fans of the wealth tax, but of course neither of those got the Democratic nomination. Joe Biden doesn't appear to embrace a wealth tax, but does actually suggest a tax that should be levied on unrealized value in capital assets on death, kind of a sort of capital gains tax on death, whether or not the assets are actually disposed of. So let's have a look at those countries in Europe that actually do currently have a wealth tax: Spain, Belgium, Norway, and Switzerland. So Spain applies a wealth tax to residents on pretty much everything that they own, apart from private family businesses, above, so a total sort of nil rate value of 500 to 700,000 euros. The rate of tax that's levied depends on the autonomous region that you're in. So it could be from about 2.2% up to 2.7%, and some regions have no tax whatsoever, the most obvious one being Madrid. When you look at Norway, then they have a tax applied to all assets with a fairly low threshold, around £2 million, sort of 1.5, 1.7 million kroner. And everything above that is subject to the tax. The tax rate, though, is very low, less than 1%. In Switzerland, it's applied on a cantonal basis, so not at a federal level. So that also is a very low rate, about 0.8% on pretty much all assets, because if you're living in Switzerland, you're going to be largely, probably quite wealthy, and anything above roughly £100,000 or €100,000, it's not that much difference, will be subject to that low rate of annual tax. In Belgium, it's a kind of wealth tax because it only applies to property, and it's largely very similar to council tax. So effectively, you're taxed on the deemed rental income that you receive from property. So it's only residential property, just property, that is subject to the wealth tax in Belgium. So there you have it, only 4 countries in Europe applying tax. It isn't generating an awful lot of tax. You can go right the way back to the 70s when Dennis Healy, who was a big fan of wealth tax, said, after giving this, effectively words to this effect, after giving this due consideration, I've just come to the conclusion that I just can't make a wealth tax work, one that's worth the effort, political problems, damage and cost of collection. Just can't make the yield that you get overcome those challenges.